This podcast deals with themes that may not be suitable for younger or sensitive audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hey friend, it's been a while since we've had a chance to chat. Welcome back to part 2 of the Women of Juarez series. Before we get too far into this, I want to go ahead and thank a few people. First of all, I need to thank Jackie Moranty, who has written this script. I also need to thank Inclidus, Katie M., Vanessa F. I need to thank Charlene H., Raylene K. Thank you so much for being donators and patrons. If you want to support this show, go to patreon.com/trueconsequences or ko-fi.com/trueconsequences, or you can use any of the links that are in my link tree in the show notes below. I am Eric Carter-Landin, and this is Ni Una Más, the Women of Juarez, Las Desaparecidas. It was believed that the murders began in 1993, but record-keeping was shoddy at best, and stories of women going missing date back as far as the 1980s. Many of these women's identities remain unknown to this day. At least 15 women were found murdered in 1993. In 1994, 10 more were found. Oscar Manes Grijalva was a very talented criminologist who began looking into the murders in 1994. He had noticed the distinct similarities between the victims soon after joining the Procuraduría General de Justicia del Estado de Chihuahua. Despite rumors of the residents, Manes found no evidence that the women's bodies were being used for organ donations. Organ donation is very specific and would take skill in removal, refrigeration, and rapid transport so that the organs could be used. He was convinced that there was a serial killer on the loose. Manes also was a professor of forensics at the Chihuahua State Police Academy in Juarez. He held university degrees in both psychology and criminology. While teaching young cadets, he decided to use real homicide cases to demonstrate the steps involved in piecing together a criminal investigation. He began to look at police files for material to teach his classes, and he ran across 2 cases that were very similar. Both victims were young women who looked remarkably similar. Both had been raped and killed in a very methodical fashion. He decided to use these 2 cases for his training sessions with new police recruits. He also drafted a 3-page report that included a psychological profile of the killer and an argument that there could be a serial killer operating in the city. He presented his report to his superiors in mid-1994, thinking that his work may be able to help catch the man who was murdering the women of Juarez. He was surprised when the State Police Academy chief, Jorge Hostos, only thanked him for his work and did nothing more with it. When Manes offered a copy of the report to Hostos, Hostos pushed it back to Manes and told him to keep it. Manes began to question the work of the members of law enforcement agencies. He was asked several times to falsify his findings on cases. He would later state in interviews that he refused to falsify documentation in hopes that he could encourage other members of law enforcement to do more thorough investigations. He realized later that those officers were being told who to target as perpetrators, no matter what the evidence told them. He continued his investigation on his own. Juarez was a vast hunting ground for a serial killer, and the women who worked in the maquiladoras were young, trusting, and highly vulnerable. No one was going to stop these murders unless the killer was found. But the women couldn't just stop working. Their families depended on the money they made. So killer or not, they had to make it to and from work at all hours of day and night. Manes found more murders in 1995 that had the same MO. The girls all looked alike. They were all poor and young. They were all found with the same mutilations, and they had all died in the same way. The authorities put the number of homicides against women at 19 that year. There were non-governmental organizations that reported much higher numbers, reported 42 homicides against women. By the end of 1995, the total number of murdered women topped 100. A break in the case came 1 month after the bodies of Silvia Morales and Olga Perez were found. In October of 1995, police arrested Abdel Latif Sharif, an Egyptian engineer who was working as an inventor for one of the maquiladores in Juarez. A woman who has only been identified as Blanca came forward and told police that Sharif had kidnapped her, brutalized, and raped her over the course of 3 days at his home. His home was in an area called Rincones de San Marcos, a very affluent area, and the same area where the bus that Silvia Morales would have caught had she not disappeared on that fateful day. Upon his arrest, Sharif claimed that Blanca was a sex worker that he had paid to engage with. He said that she had threatened him when he wouldn't give her more money than they had originally agreed upon. Blanca's story was that he had kidnapped her, took her to his house, held her captive, and beat her and raped her. Then he told her that if she tried to escape, he would kill her and take her to Lote Bravo, where many of the other women's bodies had been found. Blanca said that she managed to escape out of an open window after 3 days. She managed to make it to a neighbor's house, and they called the police. Based on her story, authorities arrested Sharif in October and charged him with rape. Sharif was released when Blanca recanted her story and then disappeared. Her disappearance prompted authorities to look deeper into Sharif. His past was not pretty. He had been in trouble for sex-related crimes in the U.S. as well. He fled to Mexico to escape those charges. One of his business associates had warned Mexican authorities about this after he had moved to Mexico. The warnings went unheeded. After his release, Chihuahua authorities kept a very close eye on Sharif, and that's when they learned that he had crossed the border into Mexico to escape conviction. They began investigating him and found that he was a regular in the red light district of Juarez. A woman named Erica Fierro worked as an exotic dancer at a club, and she told police that she had met Sharif at a bar called Joe's Place in the spring of 1995. She claimed to have introduced him to 9 of her friends. At some point, Sharif admitted to engaging in sex with the 9 women. After that, he reportedly told Erica that he had murdered women and buried them in the Lote Bravo area. Erica refused to introduce him to any more of her friends, but she never went to the authorities. She claimed this was because he threatened to kill her if she did. The investigation found witnesses who had seen Sharif in the company of several of the murdered women, including Silvia Morales and Elizabeth Castro. Sharif wore expensive clothes and always had pockets full of money. This is how he lured the women he engaged with. Witnesses claimed that Elizabeth Castro was seen in the company of Sharif several times. He would take her for rides in his car and would buy her dinner at fancy restaurants. Based on this information, authorities arrested Sharif again in December of 1995 and charged him with Castro's murder. They also suggested that he was connected to at least a dozen other murders. Authorities had no proof that Sharif was guilty of anything, but they began to put word out in the media that Sharif was the Juarez Ripper. They were adamant that Sharif's arrest was a major break in the case. In one press conference that he had called, he seemed confused and exhausted. He had no idea that the murders were going to be pinned on him. Sharif told reporters they lie. They even go to extremes to fabricate evidence like lying, manipulating, kidnapping people, and beating up people. The media ignored his claims and began painting him as the Juarez Ripper. The reports from the U.S. came in, accusing Sharif of at least 3 rapes. The first one was a neighbor of Sharif's who claimed that he had forced his way inside her apartment and raped and beaten her. Sharif claimed that the sex was consensual. The company he was working for at the time didn't want to lose their prized inventor and engineer, so they paid for the best defense attorney lawyer money could buy, and Sharif took a plea deal for a lesser charge and was released on probation. A second accusation came from a woman who claimed that Sharif offered her a ride home, then brutally raped her inside of his car. The woman said that she had gotten away by beating him on the head with her shoe until she could escape. Again, the company paid for legal fees and gave Sharif a raise. This time he served 45 days for his attack on the woman. The company then bought out his contract and set Sharif and another chemist up in a partnership of their own. His coworker began noticing that Sharif had a drinking problem, and he could be abusive towards women when he had been drinking. Sharif was married at one point but was quickly divorced after beating his wife unconscious. In the spring of 1983, Sharif raped and brutalized a nurse who was his roommate. He attacked her as she slept. This time, there was evidence against Sharif. He had a broken lamp and stepped in the glass, cutting his foot, leaving a trail of his own blood. He smashed her head against the wall and threw her against a window. As quickly as the attack began, it ended when Sharif suddenly apologized and rushed the women to the hospital for treatment. He tried to explain to authorities that the injuries on the women were a result of a lover's quarrel. But the police weren't having any of that. The injuries were too severe. Sharif was taken into custody and the police ordered that he be held without bail. The search of his home yielded evidence to corroborate the victim's story. He served 5 years, and though he was supposed to be deported back to Egypt upon his release, he was offered a job in Midland, Texas, working for Benchmark Research and Technology, another oil company with a factory in Juarez. Sharif was an exemplary employee at Benchmark, but 2 years later, he would be in trouble with the law once again. This time, he had been caught driving drunk. Sharif was in line for deportation for his previous convictions, but had agreed to leave the country on his own volition rather than being deported back to Egypt. The oil company gleefully sent Sharif to Mexico to work in the factory there. The company represented him when he was originally arrested in Mexico for the kidnapping and rape of Blanca. The first 4 months of 1996 were uneventful. No bodies were found, and it appeared that Sharif was in fact guilty of the murders of the women of Juarez. But then, in April, as Sharif was sitting in prison, 7 young women were found off of the Casas Grandes highway, the opposite direction of Lotes Bravos. The 7 were found within yards of one another in a vacant lot. Among them, the remains of a 10-year-old girl were found. Her identity remains a mystery to this day. All of the women and girls had been killed in a similar fashion to the women who had been found in previous years. All had been raped, tortured, mutilated, and strangled. The bodies had been disposed of at different times, but most of them were disposed of in Lote Bravo. It was around this time that the maquiladoras had begun running private bus services for the workers from the factories to the bus stop in downtown Juarez, in the hopes that this would keep women safer. These buses were owned and operated by private citizens, though, not the factories. Residents and activists soon began to wonder if Sharif was responsible for the murders that occurred before his arrest. Protests were staged and anonymous black crosses painted on pink backgrounds began appearing on buildings all over the city to commemorate the murdered women. The mothers, grandmothers, sisters, and cousins of the murdered women showed up in droves to march the streets of Juarez with wooden crosses painted black in memory of those who were lost. Oscar Maines also questioned Sharif's guilt. He knew that the murders had begun before Sharif moved to Mexico. Sharif didn't know the area as well as the person who was disposing of the bodies. A car couldn't get where the bodies were being disposed of, and they were being dumped in places that someone who knew the city well would know. The examination on Blanca revealed that she had been raped, but had gotten into some other kind of altercation with Sharif. Maines considered this also. A forensics report on Elizabeth Castro revealed that the body that was in custody at the morgue could not have been hers. The woman at the morgue was 4 inches taller than Castro. Castro had olive-colored skin, while the body at the morgue was fair, with freckles. The body that was claimed to be Castro's had been dead for over a month. Castro had only been missing for 4 days. Public pressure on authorities mounted raids in bars in downtown Juarez, and soon 9 members of a street gang known as Los Rebeldes were arrested in response police had gotten from a man named Hector Olivares Viaba. Police questioned the group in connection with the rape and murder of an 18-year-old maquilla worker named Rosario Garcia Leal. She was still wearing her factory ID when she was found in a remote area just outside of Juarez. During interrogation, Olivares reportedly confessed to taking part in her murder. He said that he and other gang members had committed the murder together. The 10 were held in connection with the murder, and questions were raised about Sharif's innocence. State officials began to claim that Sharif had paid gang members to commit murders while he was incarcerated so that it would cast doubt on his guilt. Police claimed that he had offered the gang members 1,000 pesos to commit at least 1 or 2 murders a month. The money was supposedly exchanged during prison visits, where Sharif would slip an envelope of cash to one of the gang members during a visit. Based on the confessions of the gang members, the police indicted them on at least 7 of the homicides. The individuals arrested were Sergio Diaz, Juan Jurado, Carlos Molina, José Luis González Juárez Rosales, Hector Olivares, Fernando Güemes Aguirre, Luis Andrade, Carlos Barrientos Vidales, Romel Omar Ceniceros Garcia, and Erica Fierro. Fierro testified that she had introduced one of her friends to Sergio Armendiaris, the leader of Los Rebeldes. She said she knew that the gang was going to kill the woman, but couldn't do anything about it because they had threatened to kill her. Attorney General Arturo Chavez was pleased with the FBI-style investigation. It took a lot of pressure off of him since he had been tasked with finding the murderer or murderers. Gang members began to claim that they had been tortured into giving false confessions and were innocent of the murders that the officials were trying to pin on them. The number that they were accused of kept growing and was up to 17 at that point. There was evidence to support their claims. The gang had no apparent connection to Sharif. Sharif didn't speak Spanish, and the gang knew very little English. There was no money trail from Sharif to the gang, and no one could prove that any money had ever exchanged hands. To further matters, the police had taken dental impressions of Sharif upon his arrest. Those impressions didn't match the bite marks on any of the women that he had been accused of murdering. Fingerprints didn't match either. DNA was in its infancy, but none of the DNA matched. Sharif accused officials of the murders. He alluded to one in particular, but never named him. He referred to him as short in stature. He said that he likes women who are slender and petite so that he can overpower them and control them. He said he would identify the corrupt police officer upon his release. Sharif died in prison in 2006 of an apparent heart attack. The identity of the corrupt police officer went with him to his grave. Blame had shifted to the gang members. Officials had said that dental impressions of Armendaris matched the wounds on some of the murdered women. However, his attorney also took impressions of his teeth, and he claimed they did not match the marks on the women. Once the authorities had the gang members and Sharif in custody, the murder stopped for a little while. Then, 25 more bodies were discovered in a remote area of Juarez in 1997. The residents of Juarez again questioned the guilt of Sharif, and now they were questioning the guilt of the gang members as well. In response, the police released 5 of the gang members, including Fierro, for lack of evidence against them. The current victims matched the victims that had been found before Sharif and the gang were arrested. It seemed obvious to most that the men in prison could not have been guilty of all of these murders. The latest bodies were found in several remote locations across the city. The youngest of these victims were 10 years old, both of whom had been abducted on their way to school. The oldest, a 20-year-old mother of 2, who had been abducted on her way home from a job interview at one of the factories. There were more protests by activists, friends, and families of the victims. This was the first time in Mexican history that women were standing up for themselves against the government, who seemed to be ignoring them. A special task force was created to investigate the murders. Arturo Chavez held a press conference assuring the residents of Juarez that there were 14 officers assigned to investigate. Chavez had been in office since 1994 and was up for re-election in 1998. Rumors flew that Chavez created the task force in order to appease voters before the election. The task force didn't stop the murders, though. In 1998, 38 more bodies were found. One of them, 17-year-old Maria Sahario Gonzalez Flores. She had also been snatched from the bus stop in Juarez in broad daylight. The managers at the plant where Sahario worked had changed her shift from nights to days. When she worked the night shift, she could travel to work with her father and older sister to and from work. But when they changed her shift, she had to travel alone. Sahario's disappearance was treated the same as the others before her. The police scoffed as her father tried to report her missing. They told him to wait 24 hours. They said that she would come home on her own. Sahario's father, Jesus, tried to contact several law enforcement agencies, but always had the same result. She'll turn up. Let us know if you find anything. The wait time required had been shortened from 72 hours to 24. But that was of little consolation to the families of the victims. By this time, there was speculation among the residents that the police were involved in the murders, or they were covering them up. The residents had formed volunteer groups to look for missing women. They would form search parties and would communicate by ham radio whenever a woman went missing. Jesus contacted them when law enforcement denied him. A search party was set up. A little more than 2 weeks later, the family learned that a body had been found in a desolate area of Lote Bravo called Loma Blanca. Someone had called police to let them know that there was a taxi on fire there. 2 boys playing in the field noticed the taxi and ran to get help. On their way to get help, they found the body of a woman. Paula, Sarario's mother, went to the morgue to find out if the body was that of her daughter. She was met by several mothers of missing women, all there to see if the body had been brought in was their daughter. Paula had learned that the woman who was found had been found 3 days before, but no one had alerted her or the other families that someone had been found. The police had abandoned these families. The woman was Sarario. She had been strangled and stabbed, but the wounds were shallow, more like torture wounds. The body was too decomposed to tell if she had been raped, but police suspected that she had. She was identified by the smock that was her uniform at the factory. Her mother had embroidered her name in the collar of the smock so that she could tell which one was hers when she went to work. By this time, police were showing the victims' families reconstructions of victims' faces rather than the clean skulls themselves. It was supposed to be easier on family members who were identifying the remains. Sarario's sister, Germina, had started a grassroots organization shortly after her sister's death to keep the memories of the victims in the headlines. She would gather family members for vigils, plant crosses across the city, and search for clues and evidence that police may have overlooked. Irma Perez also became a member of the group. It was called Voices Without Echo. By 1998, the drug trade was in full force. Drugs were becoming easier to smuggle across the border since NAFTA had began in 1993. There were some 450 known gangs in Juarez at the time, and the violence was common to the city. Officials in Juarez reported that there were 80 drug-related murders and 70 disappearances related to the drug trade from 1994 to 1998. Juarez was home to the leader of Mexico's biggest drug cartel, Amado Carrillo Fuentes. Fuentes reportedly died in July of 1997 during a botched plastic surgery that was thought to have taken place because he wanted to change his appearance to avoid capture by police. His death sparked a fierce turf war that spilled into the streets of Juarez, making it one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire, and no one was safe. Eventually, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes' younger brother, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, became the new cartel leader in Juarez. By then, American authorities were confirming that the cartel was moving cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamines into the U.S. at an alarming rate. While U.S. authorities were trying to stop the flow of drugs into the country, the Mexican government didn't seem interested in helping. In January of 2002, Mario Hector Varela of the Chihuahua State Police was gunned down by assassins. It was learned that he had ties to the Juarez cartel. It came as a surprise to everyone when it became known that he was also a member of the special task force that had been investigating the murdered women. This may have been surprising for some, but the women who lived in Juarez had suspected that the police had been involved in the murders for years. Arturo Chavez was forced to admit that, quote, perhaps our investigations were not done well. Maybe they should have been done better, end quote. That's when he invited American criminologist Robert Ressler to Juarez. In the spring of 1998, he invited him to work with Mexican authorities on the homicides. Officials in Juarez were hoping that he would shed some light on the murders. Ressler was acting as a consultant to the Mexican government, not as an active member of the FBI. He looked into every aspect of the crimes and analyzed them based on time of disappearance, ages of the victims, social status, as well as the circumstances of their deaths. He would then make recommendations to the state police on how they could improve their investigatory skills, such as psychological profiling, which he was known for. During the first 3 trips to Juarez, Ressler spent 1 week reviewing the files of the unsolved homicides and accompanying police to crime scenes. Ressler spoke no Spanish, and one of the women's activists pointed out that this would make it almost impossible for him to interview victims' families. By June, Ressler was ready to announce his findings. He found that out of the more than 160 murders that had occurred since 1993, 76 confirmed to a particular pattern. The majority of the dead women ranged in age from 17 to 24, and a large number had been raped and strangled. At least 12 of them had disappeared on their way to work or their way home from work. Ressler theorized that one or more serial killers were crossing the border into Juarez from the U.S. to commit the killings. He pointed out that many of the women had to walk through the red light district on their way home from work. He fielded questions about the way authorities had been handling the investigations. He told journalists that the Mexican authorities were doing the best that they could with what they had. He cited inadequate staffing and inexperience for the lack of results. Years later, Ressler would admit that he hadn't done the investigation justice. When he thought back on it, the files that he was presented were lacking. He said that when he announced his findings, he had gotten caught up in the politics. Mexican criminologist Oscar Maines disagreed with Ressler. He had been involved in the investigation of the murdered women for 4 years at that point, and he didn't think that there were serial killers traveling in and out of Mexico at will. He believed that the murderers were right under their noses. Maines cited Ressler's claims that serial killers were more often Anglo-Saxon with European roots. While that might hold true in the U.S., there had been no formal study of serial killers in Mexico. Maines was also questioning whether or not the state police had actually given Ressler the facts pertaining to the homicides. Had Ressler based his findings on incorrect or even incomplete data? The killers knew the area very well. They could get to the dump sites without vehicles, and they knew the bodies would be in a heightened state of decomposition before they were found. If they were from the U.S., then they had spent a lot of time learning these things. The killer or killers had also stalked their victims. They took pictures of the women, they followed them and learned their routines, and in September of 1998, voters chose Patricio Martinez as governor of Chihuahua. Martinez had vowed to stop the violence in Chihuahua, and he promised to find out who was killing the women of Juarez. He claimed he could do this in 1 month. He appointed Arturo Gonzalez Rascon as the new state attorney general. Ressler, meanwhile, took it upon himself to have the 15-page document that was used by VICAP translated into Spanish. The document would serve as a guide for criminal apprehension. The new state attorney general appointed Sully Ponce to head up the investigation of crimes against women. She would be tasked with overseeing the investigation of the murdered women of Valdez. Ponce later stated in interviews that the state police department was ill-equipped to handle the homicide investigations. She found that others lacked the most basic tools. They had no crime scene tape, no paper bags, no latex gloves, nothing to collect or transfer evidence. She also found that police had burned more than 1,000 pounds of evidence that had been collected from the crime scenes. Members of the previous administration had also cleared her office of all files pertaining to any prior investigations. Ponce had never worked as a prosecutor, and she wondered if her new position had been created more as a public relations exercise to give people the illusion that something was being done to solve the crimes. Ponce was determined to do her job, though. Immediately, she demanded a bigger office with state-of-the-art computers and an updated phone system. She wielded authority over crime scenes, no longer allowed media and bystanders to walk through the crime scene, and crime scenes were to be cordoned off and preserved. She theorized that 55% of the 180 femicides were sexual in nature. The rest were random killings or executions unrelated to the serial murders. She also surmised that Sharif was responsible for at least some of the murders, and this made his defense more difficult. Sharif's attorney had managed to get 5 of 6 murder charges dropped for lack of evidence, which only left one on the table. And although the evidence seemed to point in another direction, authorities were reluctant to set Sharif free. Sharif had been conducting his own investigation from prison and wanted to meet with Oscar Maines to talk about what he had found. Maines agreed. Sharif claimed that the son of a local cantina owner, Armando Martinez, was responsible for at least some of the murders. Sharif's source was a police officer named Victor Valenzuela Rivera. Rivera later testified that he was at the Safari Club when he overheard Armando Martinez saying that he had killed several women but was being protected by local officials. Irene Blanco, Sharif's attorney, began to receive death threats after demanding Martinez be investigated in connection with the murders. Shortly thereafter, her son was shot 3 times as he was driving along La Raza Street in downtown Juarez. He would have died had he not kept driving to the hospital. The shooting was proclaimed by Sully Ponce to be a drug-related beef. Blanco moved from Juarez shortly after, but still led the defense of Sharif. In 1998, the Mexican Commission for the Defense and Promotion of Human Rights, based in Cuauhtémoc, reviewed the case against Sharif. The group criticized irregularities in the homicide investigation of the women. They found that some of the files lacked photographs of the bodies, and they also lacked DNA evidence. Others had mistakenly reported bodies found in incorrect locations. They also reported that victims had been misidentified. The case of Elizabeth Castro had been reviewed by a state official also. He claimed that Sharif had asked for a review of the DNA evidence and was repeatedly denied. He found that no family members were allowed to identify the body. The parents just had to accept that this was their daughter. State officials couldn't account for why Castro's body had been taken to Veracruz for autopsy. Veracruz was more than 200 miles away from Juarez and inaccessible to family members for viewing. They couldn't explain why the clothing that the woman was wearing was different from the reports of what Elizabeth had been wearing when she went missing. They couldn't explain why the body they had at the morgue was 4 inches taller than Elizabeth, or why the decomposition was consistent with someone who had been missing for a month, when Elizabeth had only been missing 4 days. Sharif was found guilty of Elizabeth's murder on March 29th, 1999, and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Thanks for listening, and stay safe, New Mexico.